Today we're going to be taking a look at creating a Rails 7 API that allows us to log into our Devise user accounts. This was a very highly requested tutorial. Hopefully we'll be able to cover everything. It's just a very simple application, lets you log in and log out in your Vue app, but it's all running through Devise through a Rails 7 API. Your sessions will of course persist through refreshing because we're using JSON Web Tokens. Let's get started. We'll start off by creating the Rails API by passing the --API flag into our Rails new command, and then we'll change directory into our project. Once we're inside of our project, let's go ahead and let's do our initial commit. We can do this with git add, git commit, -m with our initial message. Here I'll say init commit. We can then clear the console with Control L, and then we can run bundle add devise, devise-jwt, and rack-cores to add the gems we'll need. We can then run another git commit message if we want to, just to say that we added those gems. After we do that, we'll want to open up our code inside of VS Code. Once inside of VS Code, we'll go into initializers cores.rb to uncomment everything in here, and then just change the origins to an asterisk, and we'll expose the authorization header and the UID header because we're going to be using those in the future. We can then run the Rails gdevise :install command to install Devise, and then the Rails gdevise user command to generate our default Devise user. That's all very simple and familiar, but here we're going to run the Rails g model JWT _denialist command, and we'll pass in a JTI of type string and an EXP of type datetime. We'll be using these later when we want to deny an existing JWT. That way we can log out the users in a safe manner. Back inside of Visual Studio Code, we need to rename the migration we created to be singular, and the class as well as the create table. In this clip, I actually end up missing the pluralization of the create table, but that's fine because I fix it later. We then want to change both of our types to be null false, and we want to add an index for the JWT deny list, and we'll pass in the JTI. Once we're done with that, we'll need to go into our models user.rb and delete the second line of the Devise configuration. You can leave these if you want to, but I don't use them, so I'm just removing them. Next, we'll take the JWT authenticatable and the JWT _revocation _strategy : JWT deny list, which is the model we created earlier. This is just setting us up so that when we want to log out a user or expire a user session, we can just insert the token. And by having the token inserted, we've denied that JWT, but we don't have to modify the user itself, which is just a safe way to log out. And the user and the application don't necessarily need to know about each other. They just need to know about this encrypted token that we generate later. Next, we'll come into our JWT model. We'll start by including the Devise JWT revocation strategies and the deny list. And then we'll set self.tablename equal to JWT _deny list. Speaking of which, it's time to come back into our migration and change the create table to be singular. Next, we can come back to our terminal, run the Rails DB migrate command to migrate the database, and now it's time to create some controllers. The first one's going to be the members controller, which is just used as our authenticated controller. Basically, if you're logged in, this is the information we want you to be able to see. Now, this is going to have an authenticate user before action, and it's going to have a custom show. The show is just going to be the user equal to the get user from token function, which we'll create in a minute here. And then if we do get a user, we want to render some JSON that just says, if you're seeing this, you're in, and we'll pass back the user for us to use on the front end. Next, we'll create a private area. And inside the private area, we'll say def get user from token, the function we created earlier, or that we called earlier. Now this has a lot to unpack. Basically, our JWT payload is just us decoding our authorization header, the one we set in the cores.rb file earlier. We split that by a space because it starts with a bearer space the token. So we grab the second half of that, which is the token part of the authorization. I'll show you that in a little bit. And then for the second part, we just call our secret key, which we're going to be creating in a minute here. This secret key is used to actually encrypt this token so that no one else can read it. And here we're decrypting it so that we can read it and we can use it to figure out which user this is. Finally, we need to actually find the user based on this JWT payload. And we can do this by calling user underscore ID equals JWT underscore payload. And we'll pass in sub inside quotes. And then we can just call user.find with this user ID that we've decoded here. After we've done all of that, we now have a means of accessing this user based on the token we send to the front end, which means it's time for us to create the actual way for us to make these user accounts. We'll do this by creating a folder inside of controllers called users and creating the registrations underscore controller inside of that. We also need a sessions controller. So this is going to mirror what your basic Devise setup is, where you have sessions and registrations. In the registrations controller, we need to make sure that we extend this properly by calling the Devise registrations controller. And then there's only a couple parts of this that we actually want to override. First thing we want to do is respond to JSON. And then inside of the private area, we want to do a respond with method. And this is just going to check what happens if we respond to a successful registration or if we have to respond to a failed registration. Both of those are methods that we'll create ourselves. So we'll start off by improperly formatting our code, and then we want to come into the respond with, and we want to check if the registration was a success. If the register success is true and the resource persisted, which means we saved the user account successfully, then we want to render some JSON that says you've successfully signed up. Here's your current user, Mr. Frontend. Please display the information, and we'll pass back a status of OK. If that didn't happen, if we didn't save successfully, render some JSON that says something went wrong as the message and pass back a status that says, oopsie doopsie, we messed something up. Now inside of the sessions controller, we do something very similar, then create another private area with another respond with, where we're of course going to be handling the case where we sign in successfully. Inside of the respond with, we want to render some JSON that just says you are logged in, pass back the user as well as a status that says okay. Of course, you can change these status codes if you would like to, but I was just working on a very basic app and I'm not super familiar with what these status codes need to be. So in a lot of places, you'll just see me passing back OK as the status code. Because these are sessions, we need to respond if we are destroying a session, which is the same as saying if we logged out successfully versus if we failed to log out. So this respond to on destroy is very similar to our respond with in the registration. So on a successful log out, we want to say, hey, congratulations, you logged out. If we fail to log out, we just want to say this was unauthorized. Next, we want to come into our devise.rb file because we need to set up a config in here for our JWT. This is where we're going to be setting up our JWT secret, which we use to decode the token inside of our members controller. So that's where this magic is happening. That also means that we have to come to our console, and inside of this, we have to generate a secret. You can do this using the rake secret command, which will give you a big string. You just want to copy that. And the next thing we need to do is enter the Rails encrypted credentials. We can do this using the editor equals nano command to open this up with nano. Once we're inside of our credentials.yaml file, we need to add a devise block with a colon. Then on the next line, 2 spaces, JWT underscore secret underscore key colon, and then your key. Make sure you're using spaces there. For some reason, tabs completely broke that for me. The last thing we need to do is come into our routes.rb file, and inside of this, we need to hook up the controllers we created earlier to override the Devise controllers. We can do this by adding a comma after the Devise for users. We'll pass in the controllers. We'll set the sessions equal to user/sessions and the registrations equal to user/registrations. Finally, we need a get action for our member data inside of our members controller, and we'll set that to be members with the show action. Finally, we can run Rails S, and we can test this out using some custom data. In my case, I'm using the Postman app for this, which I'll bring over onto the screen right now. But one thing I would say about Postman is it is kind of cumbersome for this. You could also use default curl commands if you would like to. But here, basically all you need to do is create a body with a user that has an email and a password. And if you try to send this, just like your front-end application would try to send this, you'll see that it throws an error. And the reason it throws an error here is because for some unknown reason, the API isn't configured to run with cookies or inside or with a session store. So to do this, we actually need to come into our application.rb file, and we need to enable this session store. The first thing we need to do to set up this session store is inside of our application.rb file. We need to say config.session_store, use the cookie store with a key of inner slice session. The next thing we need to do is call config.middleware.use for the action dispatch cookies. And the final thing is to tell the middleware to use this session store with the session options inside of our config. I'm not entirely sure what all of this means, but I'll link to the actual article I got this from in the description down below. The final thing we can do is start up the Rails server again and try to run another postman command, this time with a second email, because the first one did actually get committed to the database. So here you can see that this properly gets inserted, and we return the status code that you saw earlier inside of the controller. So at this point, we're actually good to go to start on our front end application. So let's go ahead and run one last git add dot with a git commit message that just says we've set up the backend for the Devise API or implemented the Devise API or whatever floats your boat. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to actually create our Vue application. We can do this by running the Vue create command, and we'll name this front end just so that it's easy to distinguish which application is which. If we move up with the arrow key, we can manually select the stuff we want for our Vue project. I'm going to turn on Vuex, and I'm going to turn off the linter just because I hate myself and I don't want to have pretty code. This also can cause some linting errors while you're working on stuff, so it can be kind of a pain. Next, we'll move to Vue 3. We'll go with the default for the Babel config, and then we'll hit Y if we want to save our preset. I hit N because I don't want to save the preset because I've done this before. Once this is done, we can cd into our front-end project, and we'll run a npm I Axios command to install Axios for our API requests. Inside of our front-end project, you can see our Vue package structure is here. And in here, we want to open up the store. We're going to be working from the back forwards here for a little bit, just because I think it'll make it a bit more clear how we're actually going to be performing the logic with the Rails application, which will make it easier to digest the actual front end. The first thing we're going to do is create a sessions manager module, and then we'll have to import the session manager, which means we have to come into our store and create a modules folder. And inside of the modules folder, we need to create the session manager that we're going to use as a module. We'll start off by importing Axios and setting our base URL to be the URL of our Rails application with the slash at the end of the path. We'll then create our initial state, which has an auth token set to null, and our user data, which is just what you would expect with our ID, username, and email. We then need to create some getters. So we'll create a getter for each of those fields, one for the auth token, one for the user email, and one for the user ID. We'll then create one for isLoggedIn, which is actually going to set logged out and check if we have an auth token equal to null. If we don't have an auth token, that means we're logged out. So then we want to return the opposite of that, which is not logged out, which is how we get our isLoggedIn getter. We then want to create our actions, which is where the bulk of our logic is going to reside. Now inside of our actions, we need to register our users, we need to log them in and log them out. We also need to be able to log in with a token. So let's start by registering a user by passing in our commit and a payload. We'll return a new promise, and inside of our promise, we'll call axios.post with our base URL, which has the slash included. We'll then pass in users. So we're going to the localhost port 3000/users with our payload. We can then call .then with a response, commit the user, set user info mutation, and pass in the response. We can then resolve this response and catch any errors that we need to. This allows us to call out to our API, say, hey, I want to register this user, which will then respond back with our user information that we formatted in the controllers. That then gets passed to our mutator. We can then create a login method, which is going to look very similar because we're using axios.post again, but here we're using user/signup instead. But the rest of this is going to look exactly the same because we can reuse our set user info mutation. We pass in the response, resolve the response, catch any errors, and reject the errors if we need to. No idea what that does. I'm not a JavaScript developer, but it looks right and GitHub Copilot seems to agree. So that's how I formatted this block of code. After we log in the user, it's then time for us to log out a user. When we log out a user, we want to just pass in a commit, and we're going to have to pass in a little bit extra here. We actually need to give it a config block. Inside of this config block, we need to pass in an object that has our headers, and our headers need to include the authorization. That's our authorization header that has bearer space the token. And inside, we're just grabbing that from inside of our state, which is our state.auth token. We can then create another new promise, call axios.delete to the sign out path, and we pass in the config instead of a payload this time. And then we just commit this to be reset user info, which is just going to reset our email ID and stuff like that to be null in our state. The last thing we can do is do the login with a user token, where we do need to pass in a payload again. But in this case, we call the const config, we give it another authorization header here, and we call another axios.get command here, where we're calling a get out to the member-data controller. We pass in the config, we get back a response, we call a mutator that says set user info from token, and we pass the response to that, and then we just handle the rest of our promise as we have been doing. Once we're done with that, we're now done with our actions actually, and it's time to move on to our mutations. The first one is the set user info, which we use when we register or log in. Of course, we pass in the state and the payload here. One thing I'm not catching here is that actually needs to be the state comma data, not state comma payload, or you can change your datas on line 95 and 96 to be payload instead, but that's not going to work as it is right now because data is undefined. We then need to call axios. So inside of the set user info, we call state.user equal to the payload.data.user and the state.auth token to be equal to the data.headers.authorization. That's pretty standard. What's new here is we're calling axios.defaults.headers.common authorization and setting that to be our data.headers.authorization. And the reason why we're putting the token inside of this Axios default headers is because I read it online. I'm not actually sure if you need to do this, but this was part of what I had to set up to get the refreshes working properly. So if you know a better way to do this, if this isn't correct, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll update a pinned comment as I learn more about how this needs to work. The second part of this is I'm setting the local storage, and I'm setting an item in local storage called auth token, which is just where I'm storing the JWT. So that's how this token works. You get the token from the API, you store it in your local storage, and then anytime you need to request something from the API, you say, here's my token, and then the API says, okay, I have a token, let me decrypt this. This is Dean's user account based on this token because I gave Dean this token, so he's good to go. When I log out, I just say, hey, API, here's a token. Stop making this a valid token. And the API says, okay, this is now in our deny list. And then if I ever try to log in again with that token, the API will tell me, hey, listen, buddy, this token is in my deny list. You can't log in with this. You need to get a new token. So the next thing we want to do is say set the user info from the token. In this case, we pass in the state and the payload again, but of course I don't call it payload, I call it data, which is very confusing. So what I do here is I just say state.user is equal to the payload.data.user, and the auth token is equal to the local storage's auth token. The final thing we need to do, which GitHub Copilot is so kindly helping with, is reset the user info. We just want to go through, set everything to null, remove the auth token from our local storage, and set the default headers to be null. Once we've done all of that, we can do our basic export default to export all of these constants that we usually do in a Vue module. Next, we can come into our main.js, which is where we need to handle what happens when we refresh. Essentially, we want to check if the token already exists. If the token does exist in the local storage, then we know that we need to set the token. If the token doesn't exist, then we're not logged in. So here you can see I create a let local auth token equal to the local storage. And then I say, is this undefined or null? If it is, we don't need to do anything, right? If it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. But if it does exist, we need to set the local or set the token from our local storage. And then we just want to make sure again that this is actually not undefined and not null. If it does truly exist, call store.dispatch, and then we log in user with the token, which is how we get that token in the first place to send it off to the API. Once we've done that, we can then come into our app.view. And in here, we really only need to change a couple things. The first is our template needs to render a session manager instead of hello world. The other part is we need to actually import the session manager from our components, and we can replace the export default to export a components of session manager. Down in the style, we're going to leave that because that's what causes the sign in, sign out to be centered. Inside of components, then we can create our session manager.view component. The first thing we do is we paste in about 115 lines of styling. This will be in a gist in the description of the video, so you can just go ahead and grab the code from there because I don't think anyone really cares for me to go through 115 lines of styling. So instead, we'll just go ahead and we'll create a template, we'll create our script tag, and we'll go from there. We'll start off by importing our stores index, which allows us to get access to our session manager module. We'll then import our map actions and map getters from Vuex. And then inside of our export default, we'll name this a session manager. We'll give it a computed that has our map getters. And we'll we'll import the get auth token, get user email, get user ID, and the is logged in. We'll then create some data, which is just our initial props for this component, and our data will be the sign up email, sign up password, login email, and login password, which is just what our forms are going to use to temporarily store the email and password we enter. We'll then create our methods. Inside of that, we'll map our actions to register the user, log in the user, and log out the user. And then on sign up, we'll call event.preventDefault. So when we click the sign up button, we'll call an on sign up method right here. And when you call a method through a sign up button, it'll always try to submit the form. We don't want it to submit the form, so we call prevent default on the event. We then create data, which is what we use in the store to send this off to the API. And in the data, we just say, hey, look, I have a user. The user has an email equal to the email it provided during sign up and a password equal to the password it provided during sign up. I then call the register user method, and then we call the reset data. Register user is from our map actions, which is coming from our store. On login, we do something very similar. We prevent default, we create the data, but instead we pass it the login data, and then we call the login user action from our store by passing in the data, and then we reset the data in our session manager view component. That way, once we click submit, both of our email and password fields get set back to blank. The final thing we need to do in our script tag is to reset the data by creating this reset data method, which just sets everything back to null. And now finally, it's time to create the template tags. Inside of these template tags up top, we need to set up all of our logic to check if we're logged in or if we're logged out and to render the forms. We start off by creating a div with a class equal to container, and we create an h1 with a class equal to sm-title, which we call view session manager. We then create a div with a class equal to sm-card, and again, all these classes are what we defined in the styles down below. So all of that information is just coming from those values. We then create a div where we set the vf equal to is logged in, which is of course that getter we created in the store. We then create a button with an on click that says log out the user with a class equal to log out button, which just says log out. So when we're logged in, we want to be able to log out, which is what that button's for. We then create a table where we just have some columns up top that say ID, email, and token. And then on the bottom, we have the rows where we just go through and we say, this user has an ID equal to this.getUserID, has an email equal to this dot get user email, and an auth token equal to this dot get auth token, which is just all the fields we declared earlier. We're just displaying them in a table format like you saw earlier in the beginning of the video. Once we've done the entirety of the is logged in, we then need to handle the is logged out portion of this, which is where we do the are you registering or are you signing in? So for this, make sure you have your divs right, otherwise this can get a little bit messy, and then create an H3 that just says sign up with an HR and a BR, and then an H3 that says log in. So we're just using that to separate this a bit. You can see here the GitHub Copilot's trying to help us cheat by suggesting everything that we would have been paid to do, which is a little bit scary, but we're going to do this manually. So we'll just call form at submit equals on sign up, which is that method we created earlier. We'll give it a class equal to sign up form. We'll then create an input with a class equal to sign up form email with a type of email and a v-model of sign up email. We give it a placeholder that just says email. We add a BR, and then we add an input for our password. It's a type of password, so you can't read it. It's a class of sign up form password. It's a v-model bound to the sign up password and a placeholder that says password. So you can see here where we're using the data we created earlier to sort of set up the inputs for this sign up form. We then add a BR, we create another input with a type equals submit and a value equal to sign up. And that's just our submit button that says, I would like to sign up with this user account information. If we come down to login, we're going to do something very similar, but instead of anything saying on sign up, it'll just say on login. So we create our form with an @submit that calls the on login function. We create an input that just has a type of text, which is our login email with a placeholder of email. We create a BR. We create our login form password with a type of password and a v-model of login password. And then we create a BR with an input type submit and a value equal to login with a class equal to login form submit. Make sure all of your divs are correct here. You can CD out of your front end app and start your Rails server, and then create another tab and CD into your front end app to run npm run serve again. At this point, you'll have your Rails app and your front end app running, so you can actually take this for a test spin. If we come into our store, we can see that the sign up failed because our mutations are wrong. We actually want to change both of the payloads to be data. You can, of course, change the actual data in the method itself to be payload, but I go with this instead. We can then come back to our Vue session manager and create a new email account and password. I'll call it example@user.com with a password of password. You can see here that I logged in okay. If I log out, I can log in again by calling example@user.com. In the login field with a password of password, it logs me in. I have my token. I can refresh and I can log out. And that is the application working how we would expect it to. You can see in the background, when I logged out, it inserted into the JWT deny list table. So that token is now denied and we are no longer able to log in with that token. That's about it for this tutorial. You can finish up by calling git add dot and using a git commit message to commit your final version of this application. In my case, I'm doing this so that you can look at the source code if you would like to in the description down below.